Makahanya Haramita Shingyo Genji Zaiboza Gyojin Hanya Haramita Jishoken Gon Gai Gudo Isai Gu Yaku Shari Ji Shiki Fui Gu Fui Shiki.
For today's talk, we're going to be looking at some of the records of the transmission of the lamp, which is a series that we've been featuring on the Zen Gateway for a few months now because of a recent translation by Randolph Whitfield. I've given the links below for the piece we're going to be looking at today, and also an interview with Randolph, who explains a little bit about the work, why it's so important as part of the Zen canon, and it is very important as part of the Zen canon. Many of the koans and encounters with Zen masters actually are documented here for the first time, and there has been no complete translation into English, and Randolph is actually undertaking the complete translation of this extensive work. So thought it might be quite good because it's like a lot of original scriptures, it's not always easy to read if we're not familiar with the technical language. And today we're going to be looking at one extract that relates to the life of one of the Indian patriarchs. The records of the transmission covers the from the time of the Buddhas, finishing with Shakyamuni Buddha, and then his the first patriarch, who was Mahakasyapa, who then passed on the Dharma to Ananda, and so on. And we have for today, we're going to be looking at the life of Upagupta, who was the fourth Indian patriarch. As we're aware for Zen, obviously, we trace our lineage back through China, where Zen arose, but before then, through the lives of the Indian patriarchs, going all the way back to Mahakasyapa and finally the Buddha. And so Upagupta is lived around the time of King Ashoka, the great Buddhist emperor, and was believed to have been his original spiritual teacher. Ashoka converted to Buddhism after a terrible battle that he had been involved in when he saw the massive loss of human life, and became one of the great figures in Indian history, and is still celebrated even today. He brought in a lot of innovation, many of the rules about tolerance, tolerance of other people's religions, etc. Also brought in, was one of the first people to actually bring in the welfare state. They actually had a welfare state at that time, courtesy of the emperor. And he was also a great patron of Buddhism, and a lot of stories grew up about King Ashoka as well, some of them legendary, but he was certainly an historical figure, and he lived about 250 years or so after the death of the Buddha, around about the 3rd century before the Common Era. And in this story, which you can find the link to below, you can see that it's an encounter between Upagupta and Mara. Mara features in the life of the Buddha. He is actually a feature of Hindu belief. He's the great god of this realm, which is the realm of Samsara. People no doubt are familiar with some of the other Indian gods, people like Brahma and Indra, also, and that whole pantheon that's not, in many ways, quite similar to the Greek pantheon as well. In fact, they have a lot in common. And Mara is the great god of Samsara, which is this world of desire in which we live. And he features in the Buddha's story, of course, because the Buddha, sitting under the Bodhi tree, had to face the 3 temptations of Mara. Mara approached him as he was getting very close to his enlightenment, and the thing is with Mara is that he doesn't like losing people from samsara into nirvana, and he certainly is not that keen on Buddhas because they tend to tell other people how to escape samsara too. And so he seeks to foil that any which way he can. And in the first temptation, he tried to goad the Buddha back, saying, "Look, you've done enough. You're your father's son. You have a wife and child. You've abandoned them. Go back to them." The sort of rational approach, but the Buddha didn't stir from that immovable spot under the Bodhi tree. The second one, he sent his daughters, who represented pure desire, but the great being by this point was already empty. There was nothing for the daughters to latch on to. And then finally he sent his sons, who were the hostile warrior-like demons, to throw their spears at him and terrify him. But those, according to the legend, those spears turned into garlands of flowers, and they simply floated down onto the Buddha. And then it said that Mara retreated. So those were the three temptations of Mara. And possibly we can see that, of course, this was something that was rather important, because in Buddhism, because the Buddha internalized the Hindu gods. He didn't actually get rid of them. This was something that was very classic for the Buddha. He internalized them, and they became in part psychological, not entirely, I think it has to be said, but they became aspects of consciousness. Of course, consciousness in Buddhism is not something that's, for us, closely associated with how the brain works. It's connected with something much more experiential. But certainly the gods became aspects of consciousness, and Mara represents that consciousness of desire, in other words. So with that preamble, we will move on to actually have a look at the text. So Upagupta, the fourth patriarch, and it says that he, Upagupta, teaching the Dharma everywhere, he arrived at the kingdom of Mathura and there obtained the liberation of very many people, causing Mara's palace to tremble. And of course, Upagupta represents not just the early Arhat path, which is the path of single liberation for that individual, but also represents this bodhisattva ideal, making the Dharma available for all beings so that all may be liberated. And so quite naturally his purpose is therefore to teach others and show others the way, which is the Dharma. This is the Buddha's teaching, the way out of samsara into nirvana. And again, this goes back to those early teachings. The parable of the raft is a good example of this, where the Buddha talks about having to prepare a craft to sail over the river of life from samsara to nirvana, and that his teachings are this raft, and that we must exert ourselves, make our own efforts in order to get over to the other side. Hence, in Buddhism, the importance of a training, the importance of a practice. But if we do practice, then we bear witness to this liberation. It's because it says, and there obtain the liberation of very many people. And there's a lot of talk of liberation and freedom in Buddhism, in fact, but we need to be clear about what that liberation refers to. It's not the liberation or freedom to do as we want. The Buddha was very clear about this in the Four Noble Truths, that first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering, that life is dissatisfactory. It's the fact that it's never going to go all our own way. We may hope and wish that, God will look after me, or that the deities will look after me, and I have a personal relationship with them. But either way we do it, the problem of evil is always going to be there. The fact that terrible things happen, and even not necessarily grossly, fortunately, but just the usual disappointments that we suffer in life, and the fact that in the end everything that we built up will be lost, because everything is of course impermanent. So the Buddha's liberation is not about getting what I want or getting rid of things that I don't want. Quite the reverse. This was only to admire ourselves more deeply into greed, hatred and delusion. The Buddha's liberation is being able to endure all circumstances, to have to to have the faith in one's own inner power, that we can endure lives when it goes well, but also when it goes against us as well, and that we have the strength to be able to bear it. This is the liberation of the Buddha. It's perhaps rather beautifully illustrated when the child Buddha to be was born from his mother's right side. We know his mother, Queen Maya, gave birth to him in the Lumbini Gardens. There it's said that the child emerged from her right side, took 4 steps in the cardinal directions, north, south, west and east, raising one hand to heaven and one to the earth, declared, between heaven and earth I alone am the world honoured one. And that moving north, south, west and east is showing that ability to go into all circumstances. What we don't always appreciate is that the more demands I put on circumstances, that I must have things this way, I won't put up with things that way or whatever. Again, that sort of, I must have my 2 cups of coffee in the morning, otherwise I simply can't function. If I'm continuously telling myself this and never and getting caught on that sort of thing, then of course we paint ourselves into a corner, really, or we can do. The more sensitive I become to having my own way, the more strongly that I feel I must have my own way, then the more tied up I become. So this is the liberation that the Buddha talked about, that yes, we like to have our own way if we can, but if I can't have my own way, then that's okay too. And even the unpleasant is unpleasant. It doesn't stop being unpleasant or uncomfortable, but we're not frightened of it. And this is really what the liberation of the Buddha is about. And he connected in particular that wanting and that fear to I, to the notion of an I, which of course in Buddhism is a delusion. But because of this delusion that I like my own way, or that I'm frightened of that, this is precisely what I get hung up on. This is the major object of attachment to me, myself and I. And so liberation from I, the Buddha's teaching of anatta, is what's being referred to here. So having arrived in this kingdom, Upagupta obtained the liberation of very many people, causing Mara's palace to tremble. Quite naturally, he's getting a bit worried now, because Mara works through greed and hatred and fear, those 3 fires that we find at the center of the wheel of life: the cock that represents the greed, the snake that represents anger, and the boar, the male pig, which represents delusion and wrong seeing. The wrong seeing being that I can satisfy myself if I can satisfy all my desires. And of course, in a world that doesn't allow us to do that, that won't satisfy our desires, then naturally we're flying in the face of reality, the way things really are. So Mara's tool shed, his instruments, so to speak, by which he keeps us all under control, are being subverted, and therefore his palace trembles. And it goes on: the evil one was worried and consequently devoted all his dark powers to the harming of the true Dharma. Well, one can't really blame him. No king likes to see his kingdom depopulated, so we shouldn't be too surprised by this. And perhaps therefore it's worth remembering that even in these circumstances, we need to be careful with that use of the term the evil one actually as well, because actually in Buddhism evil doesn't exist in the same way that it does in Western theology. As part of the Judeo-Christian view, good and evil exist independently of human beings. It exists subjectively in the universe because we have God and we have the devil, which pre-existed human life. So whether or not humans exist, if God and the devil exist, then they are the personification of those principles of good and evil. So evil becomes a positive force in the universe, like good does. It can act, it can function. In Buddhism, the Buddhist view is slightly different from that. There is good and bad, but these things are like everything else, they're compounded things, and they have causes and conditions. So, and they're relative, good and bad, and this is particularly comes to the fore in Mahayana. Good and bad are related to things. In other words, it's whether it's good for me or it's good for you, or it's bad for me or it's bad for you. It can, of course, be good for me and bad for you, and vice versa as well. So it's not to say that terrible things are not wicked. They are wicked, but they are still compounded things at the end of the day. And in the early teaching, and this was very important because this view of good and bad did change in Buddhism. In the early teaching, of course, there are the rules of good conduct, of course, which run through the whole of Buddhism, the precepts and so forth. But it was the ideal was that the Arhat lived obviously this life of very good conduct. But in the Mahayana, it was problematic, particularly because what is good can change. And what is bad can change. And again, we also reflect that in our own culture as well. We have the saying in English, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the curious thing is that, if we look at some of the terrible wars that have happened, a lot of them are often based on ideals that at their heart have something very good about them, but they became vehicles for those great passions, greed, hatred, and delusion. So also if we consider in Chinese thought and philosophy, most people are probably familiar with that yin and yang, the black fish with the white eye and the white fish with the black eye. And if we walk around that rim and start, say, at the tail of the white fish, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and comes to a maximum. And then just as at its height, suddenly the black seed appears. The white then tails very quickly off, and we're on the tail of the black fish, which then also begins to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and we reach that maximum, and at that peak there appears the white eye, the white seed. The black then tails off, and we're back on the white seed, on the white tail again. And the point about these two is that they are conjoined. They cannot be apart. Unlike in Western culture, if you have good and evil as objective forces, then you can destroy one and the other can prevail. So, like St. George and the dragon, St. George represents the good. He slays the dragon, which is the evil, and then good prevails. And this is possible with this view, but with a Chinese view, and certainly with Mahayana, this is not possible. We cannot have one without the other. Because of all things are impermanent, good inevitably will come to an end, which means it has to be replaced by something that it is not, its opposite. And evil also is impermanent and must come to an end, and must in the end transform into something that it is not, which is the good. So it's two very, very different views here, and we need to be mindful of this when we are dealing with Mara. Mara appears evil because he seeks to undermine the Dharma, because he seeks to subvert and thwart the Buddha, who are our liberators. But in his own terms, he simply doesn't want his kingdom to be depopulated. Both of those things are true in this story, and so quite important that we are cognizant of this when we're dealing with the Mahayana. So the evil one was worried and constantly devoted all his dark powers to the harming of the true Dharma. The master then entered Samadhi to investigate the cause of the trouble. And Samadhi is that oneness, it's the state of meditation. Sam, which means to join together two things that have come apart. This is, of course, the heart of Buddhist practice, to give myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. That bringing together, because most of the time our consciousness is split, of course. I'm walking down the street, but my mind is elsewhere. That dichotomy there, that split are the two things that have drifted apart, that with that samadhi need to come together. When that happens, when that samadhi arises, which is the state of meditation, whether in sitting on a cushion or whether meditation in activities, then the heart itself becomes like a mirror. And it simply reflects things as they really are. And in that mirror, rather like in a lot of those fairy tale stories, even say Snow White, mirror, mirror on the wall, there's these stories of the magic mirrors that can see, things at a distance and can see, they have these sort of supernormal powers, and they're a way of indicating that this, or we can use it as an analogy, a way of indicating that the heart mirror can pick up the most subtle things that I in myself cannot. And so here we have a part of this story. So entering into this samadhi to investigate the cause of the trouble, the evil one spying on him was stealthily holding a precious jade necklace, which he then slipped around Upagupta's neck. So this precious jade necklace, well, of course, if you're familiar with the Vinaya rules of monks and nuns, Buddhist monks and nuns do not wear jewellery and may not wear jewellery. So putting a precious jade necklace around his neck he was trying to tempt him, basically, to break the rules, as it were. And this is something that's very interesting, because having slipped this around Upagupta's neck, he was obviously hoping now, with the rules being broken, karma producing, this would ruin Upagupta. It would create karma for him, unskillful karma for him, and would admire him in desire. This is what it's about. But interestingly, that doesn't happen with Upagupta. And neither, and this is the other important point, neither does Upagupta snatch the necklace, take it off and throw it away, because that would be anger, and that would be aversion, which would mean he'd already fallen into the desire. And this is something that we need to be careful of, and precisely why the Mahayana had problems with this question over just the good, just the good, just the good, because a little bit it becomes fake. It becomes something I must do, and it can easily be used to cover over the sort of darker elements of the human psyche. There's that wonderful story of the old woman who sponsors a monk, one of these sort of recluses, a bit like a hermit, on her property, and she builds him a little hut and provides him with all his food and so forth. And he lives there for a while in his meditation. And one day she decides to test him, see how he's getting on. So she has rather an attractive niece, and she sends the niece up with the food. And she tells the niece, look, when you present him with the food, just throw your arms around him and give him a kiss and see what he does. So she goes up and she presents the food. And as he sort of reaches out to get it, she, as her grandmother asked, she throws her arms around him and gives him a kiss, at which point he sort of freezes and roughly pushes her away and says, "No sap rises in this old tree." An obvious sexual allusion there, but also very rough as well. I mean, okay, she was a young girl, and clearly there was something more going on for him as well. I mean, in our more psychologically savvy days, I'm sure it doesn't really need explaining. But anyway, she went down and told her grandmother what happened, in a few tears as well, because she was rather shocked. And the grandmother, furious, stormed up, kicked out the monk, and set fire to the meditation hut, and castigated him for all that wasted food and that she had given him. And here we have something similar, in fact, or not similar, something that's the very opposite. Upagupta did not snatch that necklace and throw it away. How dare you put that around my neck? Because suddenly that reveals something that in the heart that has not actually been gentled, but has in fact been covered up with piety. And this sort of piety, this false piety, is always warned about, particularly in the Mahayana. So, the master, arising out of samadhi, then took 3 corpses, that of a man, a dog, and a snake, and transformed them into a beautiful garland. Speaking mild and assuaging words, the master said to the evil one, You have given me a precious necklace of value most rare. With this beautiful garland, I, for my part, would respectfully like to reciprocate. Now, so the master then plays the game. And this is, again, if we're familiar with our stories, training stories, and a bit of folklore and fairy tales, quite a common thing, because the Mara figure, rather like the devil actually in European folklore, is a trickster figure. And this is of course what Mara's doing. He's playing tricks. He's playing his tricks. And Upagupta, instead of becoming upset with him, actually plays along with him. He sees perfectly well, because of his samadhi, he sees perfectly well what Mara is up to. But he engages with Mara. He doesn't seek to repel him or get rid of him. He realizes that to do that would be to end up being emired with Mara, and that's very easily done. Again, this is the problem with the good, or the good only. When it can blind, which is why we need to be careful. So instead, he takes these three things: a man, a dog, and a snake. And I have to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what they represent. But I have no doubt that they do represent something. I suspect they may well represent the three fires again, in a slightly different form. Instead of the cockerel, the snake, and the boar, we have a man, a dog, and a snake. Yeah, certainly dogs like to bolt their food, and possibly the man is subject to delusion. But considering what happens, it's very likely that it's something along those lines. Anyway, so these are transformed into a most beautiful garland, something that disguises their true nature, which often happens, with greed, hatred, and delusion. At the beginning, those good intentions, they seem beautiful. They seem, absolute must-haves. And it's only when we get them that we begin to realize either that they're not as satisfactory as the original picture portrayed them, or in fact they cause us an awful lot of trouble. It's a little bit like if I'm a real sort of petrol head, and I save up and want a brand new car, and I'm sort of thinking, this is something I really have, only to discover that apart from the fact that the car itself was very expensive, so's insurance, so's looking after it, so's maintaining it, so's providing garage space for it, it all becomes a lot more expensive than I originally conceived, and that takes the gloss off the original desired vision. And sometimes I don't even see that until later, particularly when I act impulsively. I buy something impulsively. I ignore the context that it has arisen in, such as how much it costs, or whether I can afford it, or where it's going to go, or whether or not I will really use it, all that sort of thing. So here we have this beautiful garland, which then the evil one stretches out his neck, and Upagupta immediately places over him, and instantly the garland changes into three foul corpses overripe with worms and maggots, and ladling it on nice and thick. Of course, what we have here is old age, sickness, and death, hardcore Buddhism, and it's really what this is showing is that, of course, this is the outcome of following samsara. This is the outcome. This is the problem with samsara. It enmeshes us further in this problem of loss and suffering, rather than leading to liberation. So it's rather a picturesque way of showing the 12-link chain of arising due to conditions. Or the Buddha's own story, the Buddha's own realization, the horror of old age, sickness, and death, and of course this awareness of loss and this realization of loss in one's life is a big motivator. This is why, for example, in the Satipatthana Sutta, the four foundations of awareness, there are those 9 cemetery meditations where the monk goes to the charnel ground and sees the corpse, and as it goes through its 9 stages of decomposition, reminds himself that just as this corpse is full of those maggots and worms, so his body will be too, and therefore do not get too attached to it, is the point being made here. So the evil one was disgusted and very angry, so full of that repulsion, which of course I am when suddenly that other side is realized, the other side of desire. Even with the exhaustion of his spiritual strength through rage and sadness, he was unable to extricate himself. And it's very sad. It is sad. It's pitiful, because we've all been there. We've raged against the dying of the light in our own way, small or large. Maybe not actual death, but the end of something that we really didn't want to, or having, not anticipated something that perhaps we kick ourselves later for not really having our eyes open. But this is the point. Being ensnared by the passions we do not see clearly. So then he goes up to through all the 6 heavens of desire, telling all the heavenly kings about what had happened. He even went to Brahma, and Brahma is one of the great Hindu gods who actually exists outside of space and time, outside of samsara, or outside of the world of coming to be and ceasing to be. He's the timeless God, and yet none of them could, seem to be able to help him. Certainly not the gods of desire, because they're rather like Mara himself. We all get rather, talk to other people like ourselves and commiserate and sort of, I tell you about my operation and you tell me about yours, and I tell you how miserable I am and you tell me how miserable you are, and we have a thoroughly good time, but we're not really of much help to each other in this way. Anyway, so he even went to Brahma in search of release from his difficulty. Each of these said this spiritual transformation was executed by a disciple of the Buddha with the 10 powers. How can low-ranking commoners dispatch the deed? And the Mara said, this being so, what to do now? And Brahma, obviously not being subject to samsara, said, you should take refuge in the venerable master who can remove it, and recited a gatha, which is a verse, to cause the Mara's return to heal. If one falls because of gravity, then by gravity one has to get up. Seeking to rise without using gravity is ultimately unreasonable. And it's a little bit sort of, it's a nice way of saying, look, Upagupta was the one that put this on you, so he's going to have to be the one that takes it off. And this is a very old idea, a little bit of like hair of the dog, in fact, in folk medicine, there's a whole system based on this, or several systems based on this, but certainly what was known as the doctrine of signatures. And that is, it was considered that, for example, if you had an ailment of the eye, then there's a plant called eyebright, and it has some sort of rather like daisy looking flowers, but they look like eyes. And because they look like eyes, this was the signature. It signaled that this plant could help you with eye ailments and so on and so forth. And so it was considered that if a plant looked like the originating cause, then it could cure it. And that view is still prevalent now, and that a little bit of the poison and originating poison can help cure a sickness that's actually caused by that. So this is the same view. This is the same point that Brahma is actually making. Look, you got yourself into this, and Upagupta put this around you, so he's going to have to be the one who takes it off you. So Mara accepted the pointer, and so went and prostrated himself at Upagupta's feet and showed the proper regret and repentance, which of course that's offloading, that's realization that I cannot help myself, and therefore I have to place myself in the hands of a higher power. And Upagupta said, will you from now on continue to do harm to the true Dharma of the Tathagata or not? And he says, the Tathagata being another name for the Buddha. I vow to turn to the Buddha's way, replied the evil one, and will forever cease from not doing good. If this be so, said Upagupta, you may then chant aloud that you take refuge in the three jewels. And this taking refuge in the three jewels, what is known as the three refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, the teachings, I take refuge in the community and the Sangha. I take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dharma and Sangha. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha are the three jewels. And that taking of the refuges is perhaps the closest Buddhism has to the conception of Christian baptism. It's the moment when you can truly call yourself a Buddhist, because you're now, and obviously you have to carry that through into practice and actually living the life of that the Buddha laid out. But presuming those two things go together, one becomes a Buddhist through the power of the three jewels. So in other words, Mara was converted to Buddhism, and it's a wonderful thing because actually demons, in the Western sense, if good and evil are separate, then everybody's stuck in one's own role. But in the East, because of this interdependence, like the yin yang, because of this interdependence that exists between all things, it's much more fluid. And the realization is that a destructive force is still a destructive force. That's its character, that's its nature. But if it's placed in somewhere where it can actually be of use, it attains a harmony. And again, it's this view, because Buddhism is very nature-based, and nature obviously is creative and destructive, and has to be. Without destruction, new life cannot come up, because all the resources are tied up in old forms. So the old forms must go, like the old leaves must fall off for the next year's leaves to show through. If things follow in that way, then there is a natural cycle, and everything has its part to play, even Mara. Adoration to the master of the three samadhis, says Mara joyfully, to the sage disciple of the 10 powers. Today I wish to turn to him without countenancing the existence of any meanness or weakness. And that meanness and weakness refers to application to the practice. In other words, he's inspired and full of enthusiasm now for walking the Buddha's way. Okay, well, I think with that we can leave that there, and hopefully that brings a little bit of enlightenment to that particular passage from the record of the transmission of the lamp and the life of Upagupta.
Yate